Okay, so this is just a short video following up from my previous videos. I did the core rules, sort of an overview, and a lot of the rules that I looked at have been addressed by this sort of day one FAQ and errata. So I'm just going to quickly cover them. A lot of the changes are insignificant or things that we're sort of used to, and they're just sort of adding the rule in. So this one shouldn't take too long. All right. This dice thing just says you can't re-roll a re-roll. This has always been the case in Age of Sigmar since like forever. It just looks like they forgot to include this rule and assumed it the same way I assumed it, same way everyone else assumed it. So they're just re-adding that back in. This slain models rule is new. So add the following: you must remove the fewest models possible to make the unit a single coherent group. The behavior this is trying to prevent is you can set your unit up in a way so that when you take a casualty, you have to lose additional models because of coherency, right? If you put like two little groups of 3 and then a line across the middle of a unit, then as soon as you take a single casualty, you'll have to take extra casualties to make the unit coherent. And if you're a really savvy player, there are situations where you can do this. And when you're taking the casualties, instead of taking casualties that fix the coherency problem, you just take additional casualties that you don't need to take. And then after you've taken all the casualties you want, then you take the models that fix the coherency problem. And the reason you might do this is to maybe make the charge distance of an enemy unit longer, or you might be trying to get within a wholly within aura. So you're taking additional casualties to bring the edge of that unit into that range for that aura or something like that. So rare circumstances, but if you're really mechanically switched on and you're paying attention, there are ways you could game the coherency system. It looks like they really, really, really don't want you gaming the coherency system. They're locking down on it, making it very tight. So they've added this restriction. When you're taking casualties, you have to do it in a pretty sensible way. You want to minimize the casualties, and basically the combination of all of the rules around coherency and casualty taking means you don't have much choice about which models you take in terms of coherency. You have to take the ones that maintain the coherency the most pretty much all the time. 30.0 order of effects. Add the following. Some abilities have a delayed effect. If more than one of these effects would be resolved at the same time, the active player resolves the delayed effect of their abilities first in an order if they're choosing, then the opponent does the same. This makes sense to me. The bit I like most about this extra wording is that it says some abilities have a delayed effect if more than one of these effects would be resolved at the same time. The problem with this order of effects rule is that it doesn't, actually I'll bring it up for you. It doesn't talk about when to apply it, right? The effects of passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently. The effects of the active player's passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently. Especially with this rule here, this is very confusing because it doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you the context of where the order of effects rules apply. And they only make sense, order of effects only makes sense in situations when multiple rules happen at the exact same moment in time, and order of effects gives you a way of putting one before the other so that you know exactly how they're going to be resolved. These aren't worded like that, but this new edition says specifically if these effects are resolved at the same time. That clears the whole rule up, makes it work, and I think that's the intention for this as well, but in any case, I like this a lot, and this is just sort of a sensible rule that works in a pretty straightforward manner. Errata, this combat phase change is literally just changing this reference to correct it. 20.0 weapon abilities, this is a substantive change. Change the companion weapon ability to this weapon is not affected by friendly abilities that affect weapon characteristics or the attack sequence. Before this change, the companion weapon said that it's not affected by friendly abilities used by units. Now it only cares whether the ability is friendly or not. So before, the way the rules were written, if the player used an ability as opposed to one of their units, then that could affect companion weapons. So if your battle traits gave you a buff and you targeted one of your units as the player, you could gain the benefits of that buff on the companion weapons. Now, with this new wording, companion weapons consistently, you cannot buff them either using things from your units or from your battle traits or any of that. This is a good ruling, makes the thing much more consistent, much more straightforward, and much easier to understand. So I'm glad that they've made this change, even if it makes my Slaves to Darkness slightly weaker. 32.1, contesting an objective. I'm pretty certain this rule is exactly the same. I think they just added a reference here and a designer's note. So for the purposes other than determining objective control, a unit can contest more than one objective. If you're contesting two objectives, you have to pick which one you're contesting for the purposes of scoring. But there are lots of rules in the game that care about, like, maybe this unit gets +1 to hit against enemy units that are contesting an objective. All of those rules really just care about where you're standing in relation to objectives. They don't care about whether you actually are scoring points for those objectives. And that's just a clarification to that effect. Okay. Using abilities. When resolving the effects of an ability that refers to a save characteristic of 3 or better, what does better mean? It means a save characteristic with a lower value than 3, such as 2+, that better protects against incoming damage. I actually really like this ruling. I think most people, or this FAQ, most people interpret this ability this way, but for some people, the English language means, like, if you just read the sentence 3+ or better means or greater. Some people just use that word that way. Not many people, but some people use it that way. And so you might think 3+, 4+, 5+, because that's greater. But they've clarified when they mean or better, they mean a 2+ save is a better armor save than a 3+ save. So it's that kind of better. So good FAQ. I like when they do niche questions. I know it's frequently asked questions, but I actually wish it was like anyone, anywhere asked the question. FAQs don't hurt your game. They just give people some sort of reference to hold on to in the unique case, maybe, that they're in this situation of having the question. 9.1.1, setting up objectives and terrain features. If a battle plan instructs you to set up an objective on the corner of a battlefield, should you place the entire marker on the battlefield, or should the center of the marker be on the corner? The center should be in the corner. This is one of those things where when you look at a battle plan, it completely makes sense. But if your table is actually the size of a battlefield, like instead of playing on a playmat on a really large table, you actually got a 60 by 44 inch bit of MDF and you're playing on that. When you go to put your objective marker on the corner of the table, it's just going to fall off. So I can understand how this question comes up. Yes, you'll need to get a bit of blue tack and like blue tack it onto the corner. That's just how it's going to work. 15.2, moving across terrain. The rules for moving across terrain state the model cannot end a move mid-climb. How can you tell if a model is mid-climb? This one is a little bit confusing. A model is mid-climb if it is not possible to rest it on its base in that location without additional support. Okay. Sort of so far so good. As there is a wide variety of terrain and models, it is acceptable for a model to end a move with its base at a slight angle because of uneven terrain beneath it. But at least half of its base must be within 1 inch of the terrain feature that the model is on, or it will be considered mid-climb. This is not necessarily an intuitive ruling. So I'm going to give you an example. We're going to use some MDF and this paint to represent a zombie dragon. The MDF is actually a zombie dragon, and the paint is a terrain feature. I'm looking over here because this is where my camera feed is. Okay, so what this is saying is, if you're sitting like this, then you're at an angle, right? But there's a distinction between doing this and maybe propping your guy up against like a wall. If you had a wall and you put your guy against the wall, what's the difference between that and just sort of like sitting on terrain, but it's a bit rocky, so there's a slight angle underneath your base? So that's the ambiguity this is trying to resolve. There's, you know, how much of an angle, or how much of a, what's the difference between just sitting on uneven terrain and standing on something to have additional support, right? And the way they resolve this is saying, well, you can have a slight angle, that's allowed, but at least half of its base has to be within an inch of the terrain feature, or you're going to be considered mid-climb. So you can, again, just trying to make sure the camera can see it, you can sit like this with this angle because more than half of the base, or at least half of the base, is within 1 inch of the terrain feature. This is the terrain feature that I'm talking about, if you assume it extends this way. But if you were more like this, right, you can see there's still a slight angle, but less than half of my base is within an inch. This would be considered mid-climb. That's a little bit confusing. This is not considered mid-climb. This is considered mid-climb. Maybe that's not intentional. This is not mid-climb. I think the idea is when you are designing your terrain, don't make anything this tall, okay? They have a cutoff at 1 inch. They say anything higher than an inch is like part of the terrain that you have to measure to go up and down. Anything less than an inch, then you can just walk over as though it's not there. And for some terrain designers, that means you can make things that are, 9.9 or whatever, 9.9 of an inch, right? Almost an inch tall. But those bits of terrain, anything that's almost an inch tall, is going to be really annoying because the rules let you stand on it, right? It's not unstable. You can stand on that part of the terrain, but it'll make you have this angle and it'll cause weird rule situations when you do that. Instead, anything that's less than an inch tall should be pretty much the ground. It can be like tufts of grass or small rocks or anything, but make them either really, really small and part of the flat area of the terrain, or make them above an inch tall. So when you're designing terrain, just keep that 1 inch thing in mind. Either keep it flat or above an inch, just for the sake of rules purposes. It clears up and avoids situations like this, because as you can see, I don't know if you could understand that example that I was trying to give, but it is not necessarily the most intuitive outcome with exactly how these things work. And even things like a slight angle, it's not clear what a slight angle is. I mean, nobody's getting out their protractor, but like, is that slight? Is that slight? Is that slight? We don't know. A lot of the time, I think this will make sense. You can sort of tell, again, if you design your terrain so that, this is a wall and this is part of the ground. Well, so long as the model's standing on part of the ground, then that's fine. It's not getting any additional support because it's not standing up against a wall or something. But if your terrain is designed in a really ambiguous way, and there are lots of you've got barrels and sandbags and stuff where the model can kind of stand on it, but it's also not the ground, and it's less than an inch tall, but it's still pretty tall, that's going to cause some weird circumstances, and it's not going to be super fun rules lawyering your way through those rules. So just keep that in mind, especially when you're designing terrain. Okay, it's Dean from the future here. I'm just coming back to re-record the weapon abilities section because I wasn't happy with my run through of it the first time. So this rule, can I combine multiple instances of the same weapon ability? For example, if a weapon already has anti-infantry +1 rend, and it can also gain that ability from another source, would it now have +2 rend against infantry units? No. Okay, this is kind of the ruling I expected, but we shouldn't really need this FAQ. And the problem is that this rule is written incorrectly in the first place. So this line here, multiples of this ability are cumulative. This ability is lying to you, or this line of text is lying to you. There's no case where multiples of this ability are cumulative. Okay? And that's why it's confusing. It's confusing because it tells you something that's not true. All right. To understand this, you need to understand the rule of one. The rule of one says, it's earlier in the rule section, that you can't benefit from the same passive ability more than once. All right. So the same passive ability won't stack multiple times on the same unit. So if you gave a unit, you used a spell, for example, to give a unit +1 rend, and then you try to use the same spell from a different wizard to give it +1 rend, it would have two instances of the same passive ability, because remember, spells create passive abilities or passive effects. It would have two instances of the same effect, and because of that, it wouldn't stack. +1 rend is not the problem here. It's not that they're both +1 rend, it's that they're both the same spell. If you had two different spells that gave you +1 rend, then they would stack, okay? That's just how the rule of 1 works. And that's how these things work as well. So if you have an ability like charge +1 damage, this is an ability that gives you +1 damage. +1 damage stacks, the charge ability, charge +1 damage, this doesn't stack with itself. If you have two instances of charge +1 damage, they won't stack with themselves. But if you had charge +1 damage and anti-X +1 rend, then you would get the benefits of both of these rules at the same time. They would stack, essentially. Because they're different passive abilities, there's no violation of the rule of 1s. You can stack them because they're different abilities. Okay, hopefully you're with me so far. Same ability, can't stack. Different abilities can stack, all right? So let's read this anti-X +1 rend. Add 1 to this weapon's rend characteristic if the target has the keyword after anti or fulfills the condition after anti. Multiples of this ability are cumulative. All right. So, for example, if a weapon has both anti-charge +1 rend and anti-hero +1 rend, then add 2 to the rend characteristics of the weapon for attacks that target a hero that charged in the same turn. Hang on. Multiples of this ability are cumulative, and then this is the example. So what this is telling us is that multiples of anti-something are actually the same ability, right? Anti-charge and anti-hero are the same ability. They're both anti-X +1 rend. So they stack, right? Because they're just anti-X +1 rend, and this is an exception to the rules of 1 because multiples of this ability are cumulative. The rules of 1 says you can't benefit from it, and this one says you can benefit from it. Leaving aside the can't beats can stuff, it seems pretty clear that what this is trying to do is say that you can stack the ability. Because anti-something, this could say anti-charge, or it could say anti-hero, right? It could be both anti-hero and anti-hero. If you had both of them, they would stack, right? Because multiples of this ability are cumulative. In comes this ruling. It says, well, actually, no, they have to be different abilities, right? They can't be both anti-infantry or both anti-hero or something. So when we go back to this example, if a weapon has anti-charge +1 rend and anti-hero +1 rend, well, actually, these are different abilities, right? This is what the FAQ is saying. These are different abilities. They're not the same ability. So they don't violate the rule of 1. And because they don't violate the rule of 1, they can stack and they are cumulative. But hang on. If they don't violate the rule of 1, then they're not multiples of this ability. They're different abilities. It's not the multiple that's the problem. It's just that they're different. And of course they stack. They're different abilities. It's like having one spell that gives you +1 rend and one spell that gives you +1 to hit. Of course you get the benefits of both. They're different spells. There's no violation of the rule of 1. So there's no need for this line of text unless this line of text is specifically overriding the rule of 1. All of this to say, what this line of text should say isn't that multiples of the ability are cumulative. It should say that abilities with a different keyword after the anti are different abilities. That's what it should say. All they're trying to do here is save some ink so they don't have to write out anti-charge, anti-hero, anti-wizard, anti-manifestation in a big list of weapon abilities. They can just put it in one paragraph and say, all right, this is how all the anti-X +1 rend abilities work. They all work the same way, they just have a different X. But they needed to specify that despite the fact they're just one entry in the universal weapons abilities, they are actually all different abilities. So they don't see each other as the same ability. They don't see each other as a multiple of the same ability for things like the rules of 1. But instead of doing that, they tell you the opposite. They tell you that actually they are multiples of the same ability. Even though they look different, they're the same ability. And to boot, they do stack. Specifically, they do stack. And then they release an FAQ that says, actually, they don't stack like that. This is horrible rules writing. They could have made it clear in the first instance. They had a chance to fix it with an errata, but instead they have chosen the way of pain, I suppose. This is horribly confusing, and just from understanding the rule itself, understanding what this is trying to do, this line of text causes the problem. There actually kind of isn't a problem until you make it with this line of text. So they could have done a much better job at fixing that. And geez, you should have listened to me try and explain this probably 3 or 4 times. And it was even more confusing the first few times I did it. So this will be the take I use. And yeah, back to the rest of the video from now. All right, guarded heroes. If an ability allows me to ignore the effects of guarded hero when picking targets, would the attacking unit still be affected by -1 to hit? Yes, this is a good clarification. Guarded hero does multiple things, and if the ability specifies when picking targets, then it only affects the bit that cares about the restriction on picking them as a target. So that's a good ruling. This is another English language thing. So if a rule says to pick a number of units with one keyword or another, could you pick a combination of units with either keyword, or do all the units need to have the same keyword? You can mix and match. In the example given, you can pick 1 skink infantry unit and 2 skink cavalry units. This is fairly straightforward, but there's just an inherent ambiguity in the English language about when you say like or, what exactly does that apply to? Does it have to be 3 of this or 3 of that? Or does it mean like 3 of this or that? Where exactly do you apply the or? That's just, it's a good ruling because it's very hard to write a rule like this that sounds like an ordinary English sentence that doesn't have that kind of ambiguity. If a persisting effect applies to a unit that is destroyed and another ability allows that unit to return to the battlefield, e.g. the resurrection prayer from Path to Glory, does the persisting effect apply to the return unit? No. This is really confusing. Why not? If I give something -1 to hit and then he dies and then he gets resurrected, why does he not still have -1 to hit? I think this might be relevant for Slaves to Darkness. We've got a guy called Eternus, and I can't remember the rules exactly, but I'm pretty sure Eternus returns himself to the battlefield. And we've also got a rule called Eye of the Gods, which gives you persisting buffs based on whether you've killed a unit. So if Eternus gets one of these buffs from Eye of the Gods, which I think he's eligible to get, and he dies and comes back, he loses his buffs? That sucks. Why? That's not the rule at the moment, right? In 3.0, Soulblight have a rule that lets you bring back summonable heroes, which is namely the White King, and that guy can be your general. He can have artifacts and command traits, and he counts as all of those things. If he dies, and then you bring him back, then he still counts as your general for getting the command point in the turn. He still counts as having the artifact and the command trait that he had previously. He's the same guy. In all the different ways. So why would they make this ruling? And worse, not just they've made this ruling, but they haven't explained it either. There's no in the rules that backs this up. They're just sort of like clarifying something in the wrong direction. I really, really don't like this ruling. It's not very impactful. It's not a big deal, but it seems completely wrong to me. So, but yeah, it probably only affects like Eternus and maybe like Kritza from Soulblight or something like that. It's not many units that actually return rather than creating replacement units. And in those cases where you create replacement units, it's pretty clear that it's a new unit. All right, advanced rules updates. This is about putting models onto terrain features and how you measure visibility and stuff from them. I'll read this one, but there's a lot of further FAQs that rely on this, and I'll probably skip over those a little bit because they all sort of make sense once you understand this rule. Some faction terrain features allow you to place a unit on them. When doing so, instead of measuring range or visibility to and from the unit that is on the terrain feature, measure to and from the terrain feature instead. Unless otherwise specified, Units on a faction terrain feature cannot use fight abilities. I'm not sure why this last line is included, because the above stuff sort of fixes everything about it. You don't have the weird terrain stuff where you can't, like, you've got your guy on top of the Lumineth shrine and you can't like charge him because he's all the way up there, and then you have to use that janky rule about not being able to charge because you can't stand on terrain or whatever. That's a horrible rule, so they want to avoid that. But why do they make them not able to fight? Why couldn't you just charge the terrain feature, fight the dude, and then that dude can fight back? I don't know. It'll be more relevant, I guess, for the FAQ guys, because their guys can hurt. They can be pretty slappy, and they have a guy that sits on top of a throne. The throne's also really small, so like, I don't see why he wouldn't be able to. If you're standing right up next to his throne, you probably are fighting the guy sitting on top of it. It's a bit different. Maybe they have the Lumineth shrine in mind for all of these rules. And that makes sense. A bit further down, they use that Lumineth shrine as an example for all of the rules. So that's probably what's happening. But yeah, I don't know why they have this can't use fight abilities restriction. That just seems unnecessary. The rest is fairly straightforward though. Regiments of Renown. Oh, there's a change in here that I just do not understand. Okay. So you cannot include more than one regiment of renown in your army unless otherwise specified in the notes column of that regiment's battle profile. I'm pretty sure that's already the case, but I guess not. So they're adding that rule. That makes sense to me. Units in a regiment of renown cannot use, but can be picked as the target of, if otherwise eligible, any faction rules from the faction they are allied into, including enhancements and laws, unless they have a keyword that matches that faction's name. Okay. So it's units in the Regiment of Renown can't use enhancements and laws, which I assume means you can't give them your enhancements, and they can't cast the spells out of your laws, but they can be picked as the target of, assuming they're otherwise eligible. So like if you have a spell that only targets infantry, they have to be infantry. Or if it only targets, whatever, that sort of stuff. So they can't use, but they can be the target of those faction rules and enhancements or laws. In previous editions, all of the rules would always specify your own faction in, like all your battle traits would specify your faction. And that was the way of excluding them from being used on allies. I don't think they specify the faction in all these cases, especially not in the laws. So I guess this makes sense. You can use your buffs and stuff, but guys in the Regiment of Renown can't cast your spells or get your enhancements. But if you have like an artifact that lets you heal all the just units around the guy that has the artifact, then they can benefit from that. The confusing bit, or not confusing, but like frustrating, I guess. The frustrating bit is unless they have a keyword that matches that faction's name. This is confusing. So if I'm a Slaves to Darkness army, and there is a Slaves to Darkness Regiment of Renown, I take that regiment in my army, so my whole army is, they're all Slaves to Darkness, they all have the same keyword. It says I cannot use, but can be picked as the target of, if otherwise eligible, any faction rules from the faction I'm allied into. Holy shit, I'm a dumbass. No, this actually does make sense. It's the backwards thing. They can be picked as the target that was confusing me. So units in a Regiment of Renown can't use any faction rules unless they have the keyword that matches that faction's name. Oh, this actually makes perfect sense. I take it all back. This is great. This is great. I had this rule backwards when I was reading it the first time, but reading it a second time has helped. So you're a Slaves to Darkness army. You take a Slaves to Darkness Regiment of Renown in your army. That regiment cannot use faction rules from the thing, but they're exempted from the restriction because they have the faction's name. Okay, so they can use and can be targeted by and whatever. So you this flips it. All right, so good. In the previous, in 3.0, they had this weird restriction where Soulblight couldn't take the Soulblight Regiment of Renowns. So, for example, like there was a regiment with Manfred that gave him an ability to like set up 7 inches away or something, and you got a teleport charge thing. And that would be a really neat ability to have in Soulblight Gravelords that they don't have in Soulblight Gravelords. But for some reason, taking this set of dudes, which are all Soulblight Gravelords dudes, and putting them in someone else's army gives them a capability that they didn't even have when they were in their own army. That was so confusing. What the fuck? And that's why I was going into this rule like, this rule sucks. Why did they do this? It's because I wasn't understanding this properly. But they can do that now. Looks like you can take Regiments of Renown for your own army that share the faction keyword. If there's a Regiment of Renown for Slaves to Darkness, you can take them in a Slaves to Darkness army, and you can even use the enhancements and laws on them, right? Because they're not subject to this restriction. All right. I'm actually really happy with this. I thought this was a stupid rule, but it's actually a good rule. Okay. If an ability allows you to set up a replacement unit for a unit of Regiment of Renown, that unit also counts as being part of that Regiment of Renown. Cool. I think that makes sense. Terrain, universal terrain abilities. In the cover ability, change charged to charge this turn. That's fine. I'm pretty sure that's how I understood the rule anyway. I don't think it changes the functionality. It's just correcting it so that it works properly. Faction terrain in the first bullet point, change in the charge phase and the combat phase to in the combat phase. I'm actually a little bit confused about what this ability does. So if we jump down to faction terrain, it's changing this line of text here. It says in the charge phase and the combat phase, they're treated as if they were units for the purposes of movement, combat range, and being in combat. And it's changing it so that it no longer counts them in the charge phase. So actually, this does make sense. So if you're at the moment in the current rules, if you're standing next to a bit of terrain, a faction terrain, and you want to charge something else, you can't, because you're considered to be within 3 of a unit already, and you can't use a charge ability if you're already in combat with a unit. So they're removing that restriction. Even if you're standing next to faction terrain, you can go charge somewhere else. I think that's what this is doing. Which that makes sense. I didn't even consider that initially, but that would be annoyingly restrictive. If you could move around faction terrain like normal, but you can't charge away from it for some reason, that'd be kind of stupid. So I think that's what this is doing. Manifestations. I'm pretty sure this is the same thing as this faction terrain thing. They're changing this 6 bullet point for the manifestations that don't have a move characteristic, the ones that work like faction terrain. In the charge phase, they also don't count as a unit. So you can charge away from those manifestations. Again, I think that's what's happening. This doesn't matter. And this thing, I think, doesn't matter either. Okay. Advanced rules, FAQs, commands, shooting combat phase abilities. If a friendly unit is in combat and is armed with a weapon that has shooting combat, can it use the covering fire command? No, you can only pick units that are not in combat to use that ability. I'm pretty sure that is just how these abilities are worded, and there's no real ambiguity here. I might just quickly have a look at shoot in combat to see if that creates an ambiguity, but I don't think it does. It's in the weapon ability section. Surely that's not an advanced rule. This is it. Shooting combat. This weapon can be used to make shooting attacks even if the unit is in combat. No, I don't think that creates this ambiguity. The restriction on being able to use covering fire in combat is not a restriction on making shooting attacks. The problem is you can't use the ability covering fire if you're in combat. So there's 2 restrictions. You can't use it if you're in combat, and also even if you could somehow use the covering fire command, you wouldn't be able to make the shooting attacks unless you had shooting combat. So it's double restricted. If a unit cannot be picked to be the target of shooting attacks, do I still have to target that unit? No, you must pick the nearest eligible unit that can be picked to be the target of shooting attacks. this is sensible. I didn't clock this on Guarded Hero. I probably should have. I clocked it on Obscuring Terrain. I thought, well, if you could put your guys in Obscuring Terrain and that was the closest target. Again, we have the same thing with this command here, right? This is an opposite ruling, but the same sort of space, right? The ability can target the unit, but the shooting attacks can't. So it seems like the shooting attack, the ability tells you all of your attacks have to target the hero that's standing in front of the unit. But when you go to resolve the shooting attacks, Guarded Hero or Obscuring Terrain says, no, you can't actually target me with any of those shooting attacks. So it seems like it like negates the ability entirely by doing this. Just rules as written. But they're saying, no. You have to pick, for covering fire, you just have to pick the nearest eligible unit. I would have preferred this as an errata that says like the nearest eligible unit or something like that. Obviously, that's the intention. They don't want you using Guarded Hero to prevent covering fire. That would be too cheesy of a thing. Having your guy stand in front of your unit instead of behind just means you can't shoot at either of them. That doesn't make any sense. But in this case, they're saying, well, obviously the intention of covering fire is that the unit has to be eligible. But here, when they're like, oh, obviously the intention of shooting combat is that you can still use shooting attacks in combat. And they're like, no. Covering fire is an ability, and the ability has restrictions that are different to the restrictions about shooting. And the ability says you can't use it in combat. So it doesn't matter whether you can, whether your ranged weapons let you shoot in combat, the ability says you can't, okay? So in this ruling, they're making this distinction between the things the ability cares about in terms of targeting and the things that the shooting weapons care about in terms of targeting. Then they get down to this ruling and they do the opposite thing. They say, I know the ability makes you target these guys and it's just the weapons that have a problem with it. But actually, for no reason at all, no rules reason at all, you just have to pick the eligible unit instead. So the only reason I don't like these rulings is because they're doing opposite things to one another. And this should have been an errata. They have actually written Guarded Hero and Covering Fire incorrectly, and they should have errated Covering Fire to include this eligible sort of rider. But anyway, the function of them turns out is fine. These work the way I expect them to work. It was a bit of an unusual consequence of rules as written that Obscuring or Guarded Hero would cause that. Faction Terrain. Are Faction Terrain features still subject to the restrictions in Core Rules 5.3, the Rules of One? Yes. This is a sensible ruling, but it's another one that doesn't actually make any sense. So if we look at, this is not an ambiguity is what I'm saying. It's very unambiguously the case that they're not affected, but they have to be affected because there's some stupid stuff that you can do if they're not. Like you can just use the same ability over and over and over. So we'll look at the Rules of One. And the Rules of One say a unit cannot use, a unit cannot use, a unit cannot. And these things aren't treated as units. Faction Terrain and the manifestations have exactly the same FAQ. Are they still subject to the restrictions in Core Rules of One? Yes, they are, but they're not units. And Rules of One just cares about units. So again, I have this problem where this should probably be errata or something. There's nothing in the rules that says they're restricted. There's no ambiguity at all. But instead they just do it with an FAQ and they just say, well, yeah, like we intended that. And I don't like that as an outcome where they're like, oh, that's our intention. That's kind of how you should think about them or something like that. I like it when they make the rules work properly because if you've got something that's consistent, then you can apply the same logic that you see in other cases. But where you have competing logic in the FAQs, when you get a novel situation, it's hard for you to apply consistent logic and work out the novel situation because they've got inconsistent logic in their rulings. Anyway, this is how I expected it to work. Again, this is how everyone probably expected it to work. It should work this way. They should be restricted by the Rules of One. That just makes sense. It's probably the same thing as like the companion weapon abilities, how companion weapons talked about units and it probably shouldn't have. The same thing here, the Rules of One. I mean, they kind of mean a unit, but they also mean like the weird non-unit things as well, like Faction Terrain and manifestations. So there's a whole bunch of FAQs about manifestations and faction terrain that I am fundamentally not very interested in. I think a lot of the time these FAQs are just because the rules themselves are a little confusing and they're hard for people to wrap their minds around. But as far as I can tell, they are just rules as written, how they function. So I'm not going to linger on them. So do you have to set up 9 away from faction terrain? No, unless it's one of those weird ones that has a guy on it. Are they affected by abilities? No. Can they use command abilities? Not unless it's on the war scroll. This one is a little bit interesting. So if a faction terrain feature is closer to a friendly unit using the covering fire command than any other units, do I have to target the faction terrain feature? And ditto for manifestations. And can I choose to? No, 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 no. You can't target them. You don't have to target them. They're not treated as a unit for something like covering fire, which is interesting because they can be targeted by enemy abilities, right? You can use shoot abilities on terrain features. And so you would think covering fire is an enemy ability, so they can be targeted by an enemy ability, but they're not picked up by covering fire. So actually, I do want to look at the specific wording on the rules here, because this one is almost a bit counterintuitive about how they've ruled it. So, it's the next page, faction terrain. So they can be picked as targets of enemy abilities as if they were units. They are not affected by enemy abilities that do not involve picking targets. Okay, so it can be picked as the target and not affected unless it involves picking targets. So if we look at covering fire, pick a friendly unit that's not in combat to use this ability, resolve shooting attacks for that unit, but all the attacks must target. Okay, so this ability involves picking targets, so it's not exempt. Must target the nearest visible enemy unit. All right, so they have to target the nearest visible enemy unit, and they can be picked as if they were the target. Sorry, as if they were units. They can be picked as the target as if they were units. So to my mind, I'm like, well, as if it was a unit. And this says nearest visible enemy unit. Well, if you treat it as if it's a unit, it's the nearest visible enemy unit, right? And this ability involves picking targets, so it's not exempt. So yes, you would have to pick the terrain feature because that's what the rules say. But for some reason, the ruling is the opposite. You don't have to pick them, and not even don't have to, but can't pick them, which I think makes sense gameplay-wise. Terrain features are annoying for like having to draw fire is a bit unusual, being able to hide behind your terrain feature. They want it to act a bit more like terrain. So, I mean, you can hide behind it and probably get cover using it, but they don't want the terrain itself to draw fire. That's kind of confusing. So I understand the like thematic reason for this, but again, rules as written, this just looks like it shouldn't work this way. Again, it looks like it should be an errata or something, but anyway, this is what we got. If an ability or battle tech requires a unit to be destroyed, does it destroying a terrain feature count? No. Do I need to use a retreat ability to move away from it? No, unless it's got a dude inside it. Can I use Mystic Shield or Resurrection? No, unless you're playing Path to Glory and they're like in the battle pack and all that sort of stuff. So they're just examples. This ruling is interesting. Magic 1.1 power level. If a unit has multiple power levels, which power level and another ability modifies that unit's power level, which power level does it modify? So if you've got like a Wizard 2, Priest 1 hero, it's the same hero, but it's got Wizard 2 and Priest 1, and then you give it -1 to its power level, what happens to it? Well, it becomes a Wizard 1, Priest 0. You modify both. And I thought this was a bit confusing when I was reading the power level rules. I thought maybe they've like preempted this and you just have one power level and that, and then you've got the keywords either wizard or priest, but you still always have the one power level, and that would determine how many prayers and spells you can cast. So if you were a power level 2 wizard priest, then you could cast chant 2 prayers or cast 2 spells, or chant 1 prayer and cast 1 spell, or you could do banishing as well, that sort of thing. But it seems like that's not the case. It seems like you get the power level in tandem with the keyword. So you can be a wizard 2, priest 1, and that lets you cast 2 spells and chant 1 prayer. That's not really how the rule is written, but again, it's a bit like that anti-X rule section where they're trying to save space by, instead of duplicating all of the rules about power level for wizards and priests because they work so similarly, they're just putting them in the one thing and using a bit of ambiguous language. So I understand why they've done that. It doesn't bother me very much. And this ruling, I guess, makes sense. It's just, yeah, it's a small downside if you've got a wizard priest. Okay, so most of the manifestation questions are very similar to the faction terrain questions. They mostly concern manifestations that have a movement of 0, and manifestations that have a movement characteristic of 0 or nil work basically the same way as faction terrain does. There's very few distinctions between them. So most of these questions are pretty well the same as those. This question, I think, might be another one. Like, if a manifestation has a move characteristic that is greater than 0, can it use move abilities in the movement phase in the same turn in which it was set up? I have a feeling this is the same as that rules of 1 problem. Because they're not a unit, I think the restriction on units using move abilities in the same turn they're set up might not apply because manifestations are not technically units or something. And they're just saying, well, yeah, they like count as units for that restriction too. Again, this makes sense, but it seems like they've dug themselves a bit of a rules hole with the way they're handling manifestations and faction terrain. It turns out there's more complications and questions about them than they had anticipated. Army composition 3.1 regiments. If a hero is able to join another hero's regiment, do they take the place of a non-hero unit joining that regiment? Yes, this makes sense. I did notice, we might scroll up and have a look. So here we're on page 44, and I'm just going to scroll up and find not this one. I think we'll look at Slaves to Darkness, because I had a look at Slaves to Darkness. And maybe it's the Demon Prince. Okay, so this, I think, is an interesting sort of dilemma. You've got Demon Prince, 0 to 1 Ruinous Champion, and then any Slaves to Darkness. What's going on here is you can put some heroes into this regiment, but you can only put up to 1 of them, I think. 1 Centurion Marshal, he counts as a Ruinous Champion, can go in this thing, and then you've got any number of Slaves to Darkness things. The other restrictions, I guess, if you look at, like, this is a good example, Chaos Sorcerer Lord on Manticore, you can have 1 Ruinous Champion, but then it says 0 to 1 monster and any Warriors of Chaos. This would be confusing if you had a monster that was also a Warriors of Chaos keyworded thing, if they both happen to have the same keyword, which I think some of them might, some of the heroes, but the heroes that have them can't join the regiment. So none of these units down here have both monster and Warriors of Chaos, but I assume they've avoided that from happening, because otherwise it wouldn't be clear, like, can I only take 1 monster, or can I just take any number of monsters, because I can take any number of Warriors of Chaos dudes that are monsters. What if I take 1 Warriors of Chaos guy that's a monster, and then I want a monster that's not a Warriors of Chaos guy? Does the first monster that is a Warriors of Chaos guy take up this slot, or can I take the second, take that Warriors of Chaos guy that's also a monster as a Warriors of Chaos, and then take the second monster in the monster slot? Not entirely clear, but I'm not sure that that situation exists. I haven't gone through all the battle profiles and whatever. It's like a potential problem that could exist. So it's probably not even worth talking about. And what were we? Even a bit lower than this. All right, question. Can I add units from other factions to my heroes' regiments? No. If a hero's regiment... Oh, actually, this little extra bit is just a nice sentence to remember. The only way to add units from other factions to your army is by taking an eligible regiment of renown. Allies are dead. They are regiments of renown now. but I don't think this needed a ruling. I'm pretty sure the rules just say this, but anyway. If a hero's regiment options contain multiple excluded keywords, can it include units in its regiment that only have one of these keywords? No, it cannot include any units with any of those keywords. This is interesting. I'm sure they could have written these exclusions either way. So you could have a guide that says you can't have beast monsters and a guide that says you can't have anything that's a beast or a monster. And both of those would be eligible configurations for a hero to have. Because maybe specifically you have a hero that doesn't like a very specific other unit in your army. Definitely doesn't like the beast monsters, but is fine with beasts and is fine with monsters, but just doesn't like the beast monster, just coincidentally. So this ruling doesn't necessarily need to be here, but again, this is sort of that ambiguity created by the English language. They could have written this one to avoid that, but that's fine. Completing battle tactics. This is just asking, do you count as being in combat if you're within 3 of a manifestation for the purposes of battle tactics? You only count as being within 3 of them if they're the kind that can move. So that makes sense. And then we're talking about the glossary. Okay, so that's it for this video. Hopefully that clears up some of the questions that maybe I raised in the core rules that I talked about. Certainly the things with the companion weapon, I really like that as a fix. And the terrain movement thing, I didn't necessarily anticipate that, but terrain movement always has some sort of problems. So good to sort of know about that. And yeah, no, overall, I like these. There's still a few things missing, like the fight abilities thing. There are lots of abilities in the game that let you use multiple fight abilities in the same phase. There's no restriction in the core rules on doing that. You can already use multiple fight abilities in the same phase. The restriction is on using the same ability more than once, or on using more than one core ability in the same phase. But if you have different fight abilities and they don't all have the core keyword, there's nothing stopping you from using multiple fight abilities in the same phase. All of these abilities that say you can use multiple fight abilities, rules as written, they don't do anything. And I'm kind of annoyed that we didn't see an errata or anything like that. I don't know how they would fix that. There's probably some formulation of those abilities. Maybe they can say this ability can use the fight ability, right? And then reference the core rules, say you can use the ability called fight. You can use that even if you've used another core or fight ability, even if you use a core ability or that ability previously in the turn, you can use that ability once more, but you have the strikes last effect. That would be a way to fix it. Another way would be to like outline, here's another ability, another fight ability, and your unit can just use this ability this phase as well. So it's not a core ability, but there would be 2 unique abilities, so you could use both of them and you wouldn't be restricted. And then that ability could just have the strikes last and stuff built into it. I don't know. There's a couple ways to fix it. I'm a bit annoyed they didn't address it or fix it at all. I don't know if it'll come up, but other than that, yeah, pretty happy with these rules updates. And I'll get on to looking at the factions. We got all the order factions just today, and I'll be looking at those presently. So stay tuned for that, I suppose. And that's me out.